A routine flight to Florida ends in tragedy from a simple, almost morbidly comedic mistake. The wreckage was used for parts for other aircraft, and what came next has baffled even the wisest of aviators. Some claim to have witnessed strange, ghost-like figures. Was it make-believe, a haunting, or something deeper? I, Detective Hudson, plan to answer these questions and more.
This is the final boarding call for Eastern Airlines Flight 401 with service to Miami.
December 29, 1972. At 2100 hours, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 left its gate at JFK International Airport for its routine daily flight to Miami. In command was Captain Robert Alban Loft, aka Bob, age 55, a veteran pilot ranked 50th in seniority at Eastern Airlines. He had been with the airline for 32 years and had accumulated a total of 29,700 flight hours throughout his flying career. Second in command was First Officer Albert John Stockstill, aka Bert, age 39, who had 5,800 hours of flying experience. And Flight Engineer Donald Lewis, aka Don Repo, age 51, who had 15,700 hours of flying experience. Also joining the crew was Technical Officer Angelo Donadio, age 47, returning to Miami from an assignment in New York. He was officially an off-duty, non-revenue passenger. Flight 401 was operated using a Lockheed L1011 TriStar, registration N310EA, which had been delivered to the airline on August 18, 1972. The aircraft was the 10th TriStar delivered to the carrier. The flight carried a total of 163 passengers and 13 crew. The flight time was expected to be roughly 2 hours. Flight 401 left JFK Airport at 9:20 p.m. Throughout its cruise, it flew just as expected. It was a common flight in the Eastern Airlines system, so it was nothing more than clockwork for the pilots and cabin crew. At 11:23 p.m., Flight 401 began its final approach into Miami. At 11:32 p.m., the North Approach Controller gave Flight 401 instructions to change radio frequencies and initiate contact with the local controller. Signing off, the controller and Loft exchanged the customary parting pleasantry. Eastern 401, left heading 1000 from the marker, cleared to ILS 9 left approach, Tower 118.3. Good morning. On frequency 118.3, Loft called to the local controller. Miami Tower, Eastern 401, just turned on final. After a moment, Loft repeats his message. Miami Tower, do you read Eastern 401? Just turned on final. This time the controller responded. Loft acknowledges the controller and then began a series of practiced, tense, checklist exchanges with the rest of the flight crew. The flap position warning horn honked. From this point on, the cockpit would periodically be filled with the din of various warning signals, as well as blaring voices from the radio speakers. After lowering the gear, First Officer Stockstill noticed that the landing gear indicator, a green light identifying that the nose gear is properly locked in the down position, had not illuminated. The pilots cycled the landing gear, but still failed to get the confirmation light. No nose gear. God damn it. Now I'm going to try it down one more time, he said. Want to tell him we'll take it around and circle around and fart around. Loft, who was working the radio during this leg of the flight, told the tower that they would discontinue their approach to their airport and requested to enter a holding pattern. At 11:34 p.m., Loft spoke into the radio. Hey tower, this is Eastern 401. It looks like we're going to have to circle. We don't have a light on our nose gear yet. Stockstill said, reaching for the landing gear handle. Put the power on first, Bert. That a boy. Leave the goddamn gear down until we find out what we got. Donadio observed that although Stockstill was flying the plane, Loft applied power to the throttles at this point. The plane began to pull out of its descent. from behind Loft and Stockstill, Repo offered. "Do you want me to check the lights or not?" Loft told him. "Yeah, check it." Repo's test failed to illuminate the small, square light. Stockstill thought that the light assembly might not be properly seated in the fixture. Bob, it might be the light. Could you jiggle the light?" At 11:35 p.m., Loft radioed the approach controller to report their position. "All right, approach control, Eastern 401. We're right over the airport here and climbing to 2,000 feet. In fact, we've just reached 2,000 feet, and we've got to get a green light on our nose gear." The controller called back to give Flight 401 new heading information. "Eastern 401, roger. Turn left heading 360 and maintain 2,000, vectors to 9 left final." Loft acknowledged the new heading, turn left and maintain 2,000 feet. The plane began to make a U-turn, swinging first to the north and slowly around until it was pointed away from the airport and out toward the Everglades. "Put the son of a bitch on autopilot here," Loft said. Stockstill complied. "See if you can get the light out." Back in the passenger cabin, some people noticed that they were turning. As the plane circled Ruiz, a passenger seated in the back of the plane, walked over to flight attendant Pat Gissels and wondered why the aircraft was flying away from the city lights. Pat was flipping through the pages of Family Circle magazine, glancing at an article called How to Beat the Holiday Blues. She looked up at Mercy and said, "Oh, Mercy, stop complaining. It's the holidays. If we're a little late, it's overtime." Stockstill finally managed to extract the light fixture from the instrument panel. Inside the plastic cube were 2 small light bulbs, called peanut bulbs. Donadio glanced across the flight deck and saw Repo examining the fixture. He did not see the flight engineer remove the old bulbs and insert new ones, even though there were spare bulbs on board. Then the fixture was replaced into the socket sideways. "You got it in there sideways then?" "No, I don't think it will fit. You got to turn it 1/4 to the left." Inserted sideways, the fixture had jammed, and the light was still off. There were other ways to confirm that the gear was down, and Loft chose one of them. He turned to Repo and said, "Hey, get down there and see if that goddamn nose wheel's down." By down there, Loft was referring to the forward avionics bay, a space beneath the flight deck more commonly called the hellhole. The bay was accessible through a small square trap door on the floor of the cockpit. Loft referred to a 1-inch square light on the lower right side of the center instrument panel that indicates that the nose gear is down and locked in position for landing. The light should have been on at this point, but remained unlit. From the radio speaker, the local controller said, "Eastern 401 heavy, roger. Pull up, climb straight ahead to 2,000 and go back to approach control, 128.6. Okay, going up to 2,000, 128.6. Loft was losing patience with the effort to remove the jammed light. Again, he ordered Repo into the avionics bay below. "To hell with this, to hell with this. Go down and see if it's lined up. That's all we care. Fuck around with that goddamn 20-cent piece of light equipment we got on this bastard." The crew viewed the malfunction not so much as an emergency, rather an annoyance. At 11:38 p.m., Loft calmly spoke into the microphone to the controller. "Eastern 401, I'll go, out west just a little further if we can hear and, see if we can get this light to come on here. All right, we got you headed westbound there now, Eastern 401. While Flight 401 was flying over the Everglades, the skies were busy with other flights. Avianca 781 took off from Miami International's runway 9 left, followed by Eastern 470. Eastern Flight 111 landed on runway 9 left. West Indian Flight 790 entered a final approach. Immediately behind that plane was Land Chile Flight 451. Backed up and waiting to land was National Airlines Flight 437. In the midst of all this holiday traffic, Stockstill continued to discuss the lamp assembly. "I don't know what the hell is holding that son of a bitch in. Always something. We could have made schedule." An altitude alert sounded its C chord chime for 1 second and stopped. Loft again turned his attention to the backup method of ensuring that the gear was extended. Bob, this son of a bitch just won't come out. All right, leave it there. At the airport, the approach controller looked at the altitude block listed next to the little blip representing Eastern 401 on his radar screen. The plane was supposed to be at 2,000 feet, but the crisp green phosphorescent numerals read 900. The controller radioed the plane. Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there? Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in. Loft answered. From the controller came the instruction. Eastern 401, turn left heading 180. 180. Loft acknowledged. The L-1011 began a gradual left turn. We did something to the altitude. We're still at 2,000, right? Hey, what's happening here? After Loft uttered that phrase, the story took a very, very dark turn.
Miami Tower, this is National 611. We just saw a big explosion. Looks like it was out west. I don't know what it means, but I thought you should know.
In the midst of the landing gear issues, Eastern 401, unbeknownst to the crew, had rapidly descended dangerously close to the ground. The TriStar's left outer wing struck the ground first, followed by the number 1 engine and the left main undercarriage. About 490 feet from the wingtip's initial contact with the ground, the massive fuselage had begun to break up, scattering components from the underfloor galley, the cargo compartments, and the cabin interior. No complete cross-section of the passenger cabin remained, and both the port wing and tailplane were demolished to fragments. In all, 75 survived the crash, 67 of the 163 passengers and 8 of the 10 flight attendants. Despite their own injuries, the surviving flight attendants were credited with helping other survivors and several quick-thinking actions such as warning survivors of the danger of striking matches due to jet fuel in the swamp water and singing Christmas carols to keep up hope and draw the rescue team's attention. As flashlights were not part of the standard equipment on commercial airliners at the time. The NTSB investigation discovered that the autopilot had been inadvertently switched from altitude hold to control wheel steering mode and pitch. In this mode, once the pilot releases pressure on the yoke, the autopilot maintains the pitch attitude of the aircraft until the yoke is again moved. Investigators believe the autopilot switched modes when the captain accidentally leaned against the yoke while turning to speak to the flight engineer, who was sitting behind and to the right of him. The slight forward pressure on the stick would have caused the aircraft to enter a slow descent, maintained by the CWS system. After the aircraft had descended 250 feet from the selected altitude of 2,000 feet, a C chord sounded from the rear speaker. This altitude alert, designed to warn the pilots of an inadvertent deviation from the selected altitude, went unnoticed by the crew. Investigators believed this was due to the crew being distracted by the nose gear light, and because the flight engineer was not in his seat when it sounded, so would not have been able to hear it. Visually, since it was nighttime and the aircraft was flying over the darkened terrain of the Everglades, no ground lights or other visual signs indicated the TriStar was slowly descending. Captain Loft was found during the autopsy to have an undetected brain tumor in an area that controls vision. However, the NTSB concluded that the captain's tumor did not contribute to the accident. The NTSB report concluded that the cause of the crash was pilot error, specifically the failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight instruments during the final 4 minutes of flight, and to detect an unexpected descent soon enough to prevent impact with the ground. Preoccupation with a malfunction of the nose landing gear position indicating system distracted the crew's attention from the instruments and allowed the descent to go unnoticed. In response to this and other accidents during the 1970s, many airlines started crew resource management training for their pilots. The training is designed to make problem solving in a cockpit much more efficient, thus causing less distraction for the crew. Flashlights are now standard equipment near jump seats, and all jump seats are outfitted with shoulder harnesses. As tragic as the flight was, that's not the mystery. It's what happened afterwards.
Eastern 401, did you receive my last transmission? Eastern 401, do you copy? Eastern 401.
After the crash of Flight 401, parts that could be salvaged from the wreckage were recycled and used on other aircraft. At the time, it was common practice, as it could save money, and tossing out what was still usable was considered a waste. While it was common during these days and even today, nobody gave it much thought. That was until some strange occurrences were reported. In spite of the fact that Captain Bob and Don were deceased, many sightings of the crew were reported on multiple flights. On one flight, a captain was asked to check on a passenger traveling in first class who was wearing a pilot's uniform. The senior flight attendant said he was dazed and unresponsive when spoken to and was not on the passenger list. The captain reportedly recognized him as being none other than Bob. Flight engineer Don Repo is also said to have appeared on board flights in a strange, supernatural manner. Meanwhile, a flight attendant on a New York to Miami flight, the same route of Flight 401 that crashed in December 1972, reportedly opened an overhead locker to find Bob's face peering out at her. On another flight, a flight attendant is said to have seen Dawn's face on the oven door, and she called two of her fellow crew members in to witness what she had seen. The face reportedly then said, "Watch out for fire in this plane." On the aircraft's return flight to New York John F. Kennedy International Airport, an engine failed and had to be shut down before it caught fire. On returning to the galley, another flight attendant saw an engineer fixing the oven. She asked the flight engineer later about the oven, and he said that he hadn't fixed it as it didn't need to be fixed. On another day, Don was reportedly seen sitting in the cockpit, warning the operating flight crew of a faulty electrical circuit, which was then found and replaced. There were also reports of Bob having been seen doing his pre-flight checks of the aircraft and telling the ground staff he'd already completed them. The pilot was reportedly unnerved by what had happened and canceled the flight. While in the cockpit one day preparing for the flight, another pilot reportedly heard loud knocks from under the floor beneath him. He opened the trap door to see a vision of Don looking at him, which then promptly disappeared. He wanted to look further and reportedly found a problem that could have caused a serious accident. Eastern Airlines officially denied the stories and discouraged employees from talking about them. Eastern Airlines CEO Frank Borman termed the ghost stories about the crash as garbage. Eastern considered suing for libel, based on assertions of a cover-up by Eastern executives, but Borman opted not to, feeling a lawsuit would merely provide more publicity for the books on the matter. Loft's widow and children did sue Fuller for infringement of Loft's right of publicity, for invasion of privacy, and for intentional infliction of emotional distress, but the lawsuit was dismissed and the dismissal upheld by the Florida 4th District Court of Appeal. However, it wasn't just flight crews that alleged ghost sightings. The vice president of Eastern Airlines also added on to the reports. The executive allegedly saw Captain Loft's ghost on a plane and spoke to him before the figure vanished. The vice president reportedly identified Loft from a photograph. Although Eastern Airlines denied any supernatural events, the parts salvaged from the wreckage of Flight 401 are understood to have been removed from the airline's fleet, and the sightings reportedly came to an end. While stories of hauntings aren't uncommon, there are very few in the realm of aviation similar to Eastern Air. So the fundamental question, were there ghosts on the planes? In these discussions, there are typically two groups. The first undoubtedly believes that there were encounters and that the spirits returned with a vengeance. The other group denies the possibility. claiming that the stories are either lies or explained by physical phenomena. Let's think about these claims. Were the witnesses lying? We first have to establish why. The amount of publicity surrounding the encounters would be a great opportunity for a quick shot at fame. However, the witnesses didn't exactly become famous. Along with this, Eastern Air discouraged their workers from discussing the issue. Would you really risk your job to uphold a lie, all for the sake of being included in a book? The vice president also alleged that there were ghosts. Would Eastern Air's executives risk the company's reputation to uphold a lie? Maybe, but unlikely. If the witnesses are telling the truth, what else could it be? The other claim is that it was some sort of hallucination or mass hysteria. It's plausible. Maybe there was gas or lack of oxygen in the cabin. However, the issue with that theory is that if there were issues with a plane that caused hallucinations, it would have affected all the passengers on board. There's no indication that these issues were occurring on any Eastern flights at the time. Mass hysteria is also a rare phenomenon that typically occurs if the groups are together. All of these were separate, isolated cases. Was it a mental illness? None of the witnesses have been known to have any sort of psychiatric issues. None of the family of the fallen reported seeing any ghosts. The ghosts were only sighted on the aircraft that used salvaged parts. It's also been reported that after the parts were replaced, the ghost encounters came to an end. All in all, there's no way to be certain. There might be other explanations. However, there's still unanswered questions. What do you think? Were these stories fiction, or were the souls of the crew haunting the planes? Let us know down in the comments.